So please welcome Dr. Linda Backman to the show. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to meet you and be with you.
Oh, thank you. All the way from Colorado. And I was telling you before I hit record, I have loved going down. And when I've had this podcast, it'll be 5 years. You're in the late 200s, right? So it's interesting to watch my journey as who I learn from and who comes into my space. And when I knew you did, and then I see you coming into the schedule, and I said, okay, now it's time for me to learn more of Linda because you caught my attention somewhere a few weeks ago. And I just know, okay, we're all ready for this. I must be because you came into my life. And just the last couple days, listening to you, listening to your story, always understanding, souls, and knowing that we choose our parents and our children choose us. And but gosh, you take it to the next level, and people are going to go crazy when they hear how you figured this out. And you know what I also love is that you've been married for over 50 years. You did not even come into this work for 25 of that. And to think that, and you were like a psychologist, super like, logical mind, not even, you would not even believe that if I told you 25 years ago you'd be talking about this, you wouldn't be. So that's what I think is so cool, and why I want you to kind of go back to 1993, when you kind of realize that, wow, there is more to just living in a human body and dying. Can you start there? Is that a good place?
Yeah, sure. That's a perfectly great place. Yeah, and sometimes of course, I have told this story many times, but it's like even still, I mean, even it's almost yeah, it's actually more than 30 years since I fell into this kind of work. But yeah, I mean, we go through our life, and it's like, okay, I think I'm an adult now, and I think I know what the world is about, and blah blah blah, and then and so okay, so
Mhm.
without talking about generalities. So yes, I was in my middle 40s in 93, and I was just going along in what I thought was where I was sort of always going to be in terms of work. I was a psychologist in general private practice. I had strong commitments to work with people that were grieving, people that had chronic illness, but I didn't understand soul. I didn't understand reincarnation. That just was basically not on my radar screen. And as you know, Ashley, I had a colleague back then, I would have said die. I had a colleague transition, probably my closest psychologist colleague. And he started talking to me from the other side. And it's like, what? How does this work? And so, bottom line for listeners, my colleague was the one with whom we built a group practice of psychologists and psychiatrists. None of us were spiritually oriented, at least, doing spiritual work. Um, so he transitioned, and within a day or two, I had no doubt. I could feel his energy. That was a completely new experience for me and, my conscious awareness. And he began to show me past lives that we had shared. And of course, there was the logical, the left brain, the conventional psychologist part of me that thought, well, this is just strange or weird or whatever. But then there was the other part of me that, of course, was being called upon. It was like, okay, if I think about it now, my guides were saying, okay, Linda, what are you going to do with this?
Mhm.
And so my colleague, whose nickname was Bud, was there and showing me past lives. And as you know, Ashley, having listened to the story, but so for listeners, this is completely the way it went. Um, so I said to my husband, who we'd been together, I don't know, 20, 25 years at that point. Both of us being very progressive from a political, social standpoint, but we'd never talked about reincarnation at all. So I explained to my husband, he knew my colleague. They played golf together at times, and and our daughter at times babysat for Bud's young daughter. But so I explained to my husband what I was experiencing. And he looked back at me with a really calm, normal look on his face. And I could tell from how he was looking at me. I said, you don't think this is weird, is that correct? And he said,
Mhm.
yeah. And I said, why? Why don't you want to just say, honey, you've lost your mind and, let's just forget, this whole circumstance. And basically, Earl said, what surprised him, I think, in some ways as much as me, but Earl said, well, only now do I have recall of something in my childhood. Earl said, Earl is my husband's first name. Earl said, yeah, now I remember that maybe when I was around age 10, I'd be outside by myself, kind of at times. He said he loved to lay on the ground and watch the clouds go by. And he said, I remembered my past lives in detail. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. But he said, only today do I recall. And he said, I blocked it all out because I didn't think anyone would believe me. So basically, Earl gave me full blown, support, permission. He said, and my husband's not a psychologist. He's a retired university professor and administrator, and he runs our business and has for a long time. But Earl said, go for it. If you're interested in this, do what you want to do, take it where you want to take it. So that's what happened.
And what it comes to me is that if you didn't know anything about reincarnation, how do you know it was your past lives?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I mean, obviously, my husband had this past life awareness as a child, but I did not. Because I had read a book, I'd read the classic book that so many people read if they're sticking their toe in the water of past lives. And the book came out years and years ago, written by a man whose name is Dr. Brian Weiss. And Brian Weiss wrote a book years ago called Many Lives, Many Masters. I had skimmed that book because a client brought it to me, a client who was grieving the passing of a young adult son, probably 6 months to a year before Bud passed. A client where I was doing traditional grief work with her, she brought it into a session one day and said, "Oh, Linda, you have to read this book. It's just explaining so many things." I took it home, I skimmed it, I didn't know what to do with it. And I actually just took it back to her and, the next week when she had her weekly session. And I said, thank you, great. And I just handed it back to her. But I had read that book. So, and, you know, probably Ashley, another explanation, especially because listeners probably know this, and if they don't, they need to hear it. Um, if we're, how to say this so it's clear? Um, if we're someone who's agreed at the soul level to step onto some kind of a spiritual path, then recall comes back to us sort of when the doors are cranked open from a higher level. But that's not the only explanation for me. I had read a book. Yeah,
Okay. And then you connected with Michael Newton.
that is correct. It was a number of, that's probably a good 6 or so years later.
Okay. So let's get into that. I want you to explain because, I've had people on here, we've talked about, our higher self, the soul, why we come here, that, why do we come to Earth? And you wrote a new book about interplanetary. I mean, this IP, the EP, like all these little letters that you've introduced to me in the last couple days, the angelic realm souls. So I think we should go into explaining because the way that you've gotten the information from your clients, and that's what's so amazing. And for people that are listening to this podcast would get it. But if I was going to be talking to somebody like your younger self and it was explaining it, it's just it's so much more you've detailed these different souls. And now it's like, I'm thinking, am I an earthbound soul? And so anyway, am I an angelic soul? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
can you
yeah,
go into that and how you started
sure.
realizing the different types?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just for the listeners, initially I trained in how to guide past life regression. And then I came upon the man who wrote the seminal books. He's on the other side now. He was once my mentor. And then I co-taught with Dr. Michael Newton, who wrote the seminal books tied to the type of regression that I guide, that is both past life and working at the client's soul level. And so, I mean, and for everybody listening, it's like we all do this. It's like just keep putting one foot in front of the other, which I did. It's like, okay, train in this, decide, when do I begin to get rid of, step away from my conventional practice. But ultimately, I trained in what you might call soul level or higher self regression, that I call between lives soul regression. I trained in that, and then I began guiding clients. And initially, as best I can remember back, because this is 25 years or so ago, when I first started guiding soul clients both to past lives and then to connect to their higher self, most of my clients were souls that are designed to incarnate and evolve primarily on Earth, what I call an Earth-based soul. And sometimes people mistake what I'm saying, and they hear me as saying earthbound soul. An earthbound soul is another concept that some spiritual teachers teach, that is not focused on what I do. So, earth-based soul means um, you are a soul that was created, that was, as I said, conceived, designed, whatever word fits for people, uh, to almost exclusively incarnate on Earth, lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, on and on and on. Um, and when we come to Earth, we have free will. So sometimes we gather karma. Sometimes we gather, we make human mistakes, and they can be little tiny kinds of small things, or they can be bigger. We always have the opportunity to clean them up in subsequent lives. We also gather dharma, meaning what did I accomplish in a past life that I'm bringing forward now into, a future or into my current life. So most of my clients were earth-based souls. Then, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so into guiding between life soul regression multiple times a week, then I started realizing that, and I knew a tiny bit about this. I learned a little bit about souls that aren't earth-based from Michael Newton. Michael didn't talk a whole lot about it, but probably 5 years into my regression practice, I started realizing that about half of my clients were souls that were during their regression, when they finished a past life and traveled to their soul level, where they went home, so to speak, if you want to use that
Mhm.
term, instead of going home to the spiritual realm tied to earth, I about 50% of my clients suddenly, I realized, were going to a place outside of Earth's energy or outside of Earth's frequency that is tied to the greater celestial realm, planets, stars, spacecraft. I mean, that would have been weird for me
Right.
years ago. It isn't weird any longer. So there are souls that are created to exist outside of Earth's spiritual energy, and some of them agree to come to Earth because they come from a healthy culture in the universe, and they bring a healthy perspective to Earth to help advance human life. And so I've worked with a lot of what I call interplanetary souls. And for the listeners, they can exchange that term with, call it ET souls, call them star seeds. Those words all mean the same.
Right. Like who comes to mind is Elon Musk. Would he be an interplanetary soul?
Well, I mean, that I'll be careful of going very far down that road of what's
But
currently going on our planet in regard to Elon Musk. But yeah, my guess is, without, of course,
yeah.
having regressed him. Yes, I think he's very likely an interplanetary or what I call an IP soul.
And them coming to you, not right away, and now a few years out of you starting this practice. Why is that, do you think? Because they realize Earth needed help and we needed like the technology and advancement?
But you said it. I mean, yes, it and there's an overriding coordinating force. And we can talk about source, while we're chatting if you want. But yes, because interplanetary souls, they don't have a lot of Earth experience. So, we could also talk about the gifts and challenges of IP souls. But yes, IP souls come from more places than we could possibly count, and they bring unique skills. And the unique skills or knowledge that they bring is based on where they come from. So for some, it would be technology. For others, it would be, oh my, for a moment, I'm flashing on a woman I worked with maybe about a year ago. um, she's actually a Unity minister, and she went to her home location that is focused on, and this is vague in my memory, the details of her regression, but focused on the mother. Meaning, and I'm not talking necessarily about the mother from a religious perspective. I'm talking about the mother energy of caring and nurturance and um, it's a beautiful but not very commonly used word. I think it's spelled Succor. Succor, succorance is
Huh.
think about the most supportive, caring person you know. Could be a man, could be a woman, could be a much older person, could be not so much older. But so this particular client, this woman who happens to be a Unity minister, she comes from this home location that is all about mothering, but I mean that in regard to nurturing and caring, not just being a mother to someone.
Hmm. And the IP souls too, like they're autistic, they would come through as autistic, that type of, you would think, right?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, they're not always. So if we talk a little bit, Ashley, about so what are the unique qualities of IP
Hmm.
souls? It's a spectrum. It's a broad range. So on the not so complicated end of the spectrum would be someone who's lactose intolerant, or someone who someone who's kind and caring and is your favorite acupuncturist. Um, and then on the other end of the spectrum is, and there are IP souls like this, and I'll explain why too, but then there are others who are on the autistic spectrum. Um, the classic example I think about, maybe people can latch onto this. A few years ago, there was a man who won America's Got Talent, a man who's visually impaired, on the spectrum, um, and is a genius at writing music with meaningful words and content. And yet, to meet him, he has kind of quirky behavior and quirky movements, and yet his music, and the meaning of of the lyrics is just amazing. I suspect he's an IP soul, and he's, on the opposite end of the spectrum. And usually the reason for the um, fewer complications, fewer health issues, is because that's an IP soul that's been on Earth um, a reasonable number of times, like maybe 50 times on Earth, as opposed to I've worked with clients that theoretically, and it seems valid, they've been here 10 times, 15 times, but not 50 or 100 times.
Huh. And you're an Earth, you're Earth
I am.
based.
Yeah.
Um, So you explained, so I know what was this was another level of my learning experience with you is when so my daughters picked me, I picked my parents, but in order for us to grow and expand, we don't usually we're not earth, we're usually one of each.
Yes, I mean, usually, let's just say if you have a family and I mean, this is traditional family and lots of families aren't traditional, but a mom, dad, and two children. Um, if mom or dad is interplanetary, almost for sure their life partner is Earth-based because it helps ground that it's a combination that is workable in the sense that mom's very creative and mom easily accesses emotions and intuition, and then dad, and it could be the reverse. So I don't want to pigeonhole that it has to be the woman is this way and the man is that way. And the man is like what I like to call a stake in the ground. I mean, he's straightforward and he's left-brained and he's someone you can count on to be consistent. And sometimes the wife comes in and says, "Oh, my husband just, I wish he was a little more spiritually oriented." And sometimes in the regression, we discover she's not meant, or vice versa, he's not meant to be with someone who's also IP, because being IP can be challenging to be embodied on Earth.
Hmm.
Oh,
Is Earl IP?
say again.
Is Earl IP?
He's not. He's in
Oh,
our case, and that would be a long. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions about that. Earl and I are both Earth-based, and we have two children, and both of our children are both Earth-based. Yeah,
huh, interesting.
yeah.
Let's talk about your son because another level of my awareness now is there's mate souls.
Mm.
And
You've
see,
done your homework. That's
I
cool.
I loved, well, you can tell I loved it. And if I don't love something, it's very hard for me to have an interview. But when I have an interview and I love it like I do, you're like, I can't wait to shout you to the world. But Richard always used at the beginning, put soulmate. We have soulmate cards, and then I've never heard of mate souls. So oh, that was so cool. Explain that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because yes, mate souls is not like this romanticized notion that happens for us as humans of, oh, I have a soulmate, or there is a soulmate. I wonder when I'm going to meet my soulmate. So mate souls means that two separate souls were created at the same time, and they often incarnate together, not necessarily every life, but they often incarnate together. And their commitment to each other is to push each other's learning, is to push each other's evolution in body. So a mate soul could be, in my case, it happens to be our son, our oldest, our firstborn child. Um, but mate souls could be your best friend, your neighbor, your mentor, your grandparent, could be anybody in your
Like
life.
ex-husband, even yeah,
Yes.
ex-friends, people that came into your life and left. Those could be your mate souls.
I love that you're saying that because that is so important. It's like, well, I wasn't, but maybe I, had been married to my mate soul and we came together to push each other's learning and we finished what we intended to accomplish in current life.
Right. So, and I know we have like soul groups that come back and live lives together and change the role, the mom, the dad, the what.
Yeah.
Uh, s- do we stay like if I look at my girls, I have two daughters and they're 15 and 18. And when you were explaining mate souls and, thinking of IP or, earth, earth based, I was like, of course that makes you so curious to know, with that our lineage, where we, everything in our past lives together. But we choose these lives the only reason why our soul is coming into this human body is to expand and grow and to live in these groups of the souls. Because so I've had many lives with my daughters, my husband, my mother, my father.
Yes, almost always we've had lives with our first degree relatives. And it's not a hard and fast rule, but most times, yes. And then when we talk about soul groups, and then, we might want to stretch, expand the conversation, Ashley, too, because there are differences between an Earth-based soul group and an interplanetary soul group. So, for for listeners, so what is a soul group? And I use all kinds of different terms, call it soul pod. I have a really good friend and colleague who likes to call it soul posse, which is an interesting way of terming it. So if we're an earth-based soul, when our soul is created, we we are a member of a soul pod, and that's usually 10 to 20 souls. And those are the souls that we incarnate with most often. And that doesn't mean, I mean, let's just say there's 12 souls in your soul pod. That doesn't mean all 12 souls are in every incarnation that you have. It just means that you will have repetitive lives with the members of that soul pod. And then there are adjacent soul pods. So it's a little bit like, I like to describe it like a stem of grapes with, grapes on this stem. So to use myself as an example, and we have two children. Our oldest child, our son, is in my soul group. And my husband happens to be in the same soul group. That doesn't always happen with our life partner. Our daughter, who's the younger of our two children, is in an adjacent soul group. It's almost like the soul group next door.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the angelic souls. And what really fascinated me was how they are even coming now as walk-ins to adults to help to help this earth and what we need for compassion and what we're going through right now to get where the earth is moving to, right? You explain that. And it's like I think when you realize the way you describe like even the archangels and Mother Mary and Jesus, and I just love the way you put all that together.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there are three types of souls that may come to Earth. Obviously, Earth-based souls, as I've already said, come to Earth over and over and over and over. Interplanetary souls don't necessarily come to Earth, but interplanetary souls may agree to come to Earth, obviously to aid the expansion, to aid the evolution of humanity. Then there are angelic souls, a third type of soul, third quality of soul. Angelic souls come from the angelic realm, and the angelic realm serves source. So the angelic realm souls are like ambassadors of source energy. And I like to define source energy as like the purest love and compassion you can imagine. And so some angelic souls agree to come to Earth. And usually, when you meet someone who's an angelic soul, obviously, I've regressed numerous clients that usually they discover it in their regression, discover their angelic souls. An angelic soul tends to be a person who is, I don't know, if you put acceptance, non-judgment, unconditional love and compassion, it's almost like they're an 8, maybe a 9 on that scale of love and compassion. They just have huge hearts and huge manner of accepting people and their flaws and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's challenging to be an angelic soul on earth because we don't live in a culture that is across the board loving and compassionate. I mean, at times we live, in circumstances that is anything but that. So, but we need angelic souls. We need that unconditional acceptance energy. So there are angelic souls in body on earth the angelic realm is headed by the archangels. I used to think years ago that that was a purely religious concept, that notion of Archangel Michael and Archangel Raphael, and it's not. I mean, because regression material comes forward spontaneously. I don't give the information to the client, they speak it to me. So the archangels are the leaders of the angelic realm, and the archangels interface directly with source.
Can, okay, so explain the walk-in.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first and important thing to say is walk-ins, which I'll define in a second, but walk-ins are rare. They're not, it's not very common, but does happen. So what is a walk-in? So, when we're born, when a baby is viable outside their mother's womb, the reason we live and breathe outside our mother's womb is because we have a slice, a fractal, a portion of our soul energy that resides within our body that causes us to live and breathe. When we pass, that slice of soul automatically leaves the non-functioning human body, elevates, sort of elevates their frequency, leaving third dimension and moving ultimately to fifth dimension and above, returning back to our higher self. So that's, what happens when we're born. Um, Angelic souls are highly unique. Um, they, sometimes they struggle to be in body, but they are communicators from source.
And it's because they come in as a walk-in, is to create more love on this planet.
Yes, but to clarify that piece, angelic souls almost never come in as a walk-in. So just for listeners,
Okay.
what is a walk-in? A walk-in means that at some point in your usually adult life, and again, this is not very common, but at some point in certain people's adult life, there is great trauma. There is an extreme health issue. There is extreme abuse. Um, and on rare occasion, the original soul that animated the body of that human almost you could say is exchanged. And the original soul leaves the body and another soul steps in to animate that human body. There are never two souls animating a human body. So that's a walk-in. Angelic souls almost always come in at birth. That it's not almost never is it a walk-in situation. My understanding is usually if a walk-in occurs, it is usually an earth-based soul, original animating soul, replaced by another earth-based animating soul.
And is that a near-death experience? Is that how they swap souls?
It well, it can be. It could be a near-death experience, but it can also just be there's a great trauma going on in that person's life. Again, could be health, but not necessarily an NDE, but could be extreme abuse. And I don't mean minor abuse. And so, and again, it's usually in adult years. Um, and, but I would say the likelihood of, I mean, I can't give percentages, but so, for example, I've worked just with a few walk-ins, some that I think legitimately are walk-ins. Some will say, I just felt off for like a week or two. I felt so almost like I had the flu, but I didn't have the flu. I felt like I just wasn't myself. I almost felt like I wasn't in my body. Um, and then suddenly that all ended, and there was a great shift in me. And sometimes the shift could be um, suddenly completely different eating habits. Um, Suddenly a shift in, not completely different in personality, but so usually there's some almost like an episode of not feeling right.
Hmm,
And it could be just emotionally not feeling right. And then it shifts, it goes away. And then there's just different, either different you know, desire of eating something, different desire of type of work. It wouldn't be completely, there still would be, it's hard to describe because it's not very common. It's like if the spiritual realm decides, if guides decide there's a need for a walk-in, then the soul that replaces the original soul is going to have some commonality
got it.
to the first soul.
Okay. Okay, so we progress. We come here in this human body, our soul, to expand and grow. And that is the purpose of our soul's journey. What will you explain? Because you explain how it goes, like if we're going to talk about kindergarten, first grade, second grade, going up the ladder, every time we incarnate, we take go of the graduate to the next grade.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, what I thought was fascinating was your guides also are coming, they're advanced as you advance, but they're not the same guides as you come back and forth into lives.
It varies. So in regard to guides, um, all of us have at least one, I like to say omnipresent guide because our guide is always there. So we have at least a guide, and sometimes we have a team of guides. Um, there are times when, I mean, you're asking awesome questions, and it's like, but I want to be clear so listeners understand. Um, for some of us, if we've reached a level of soul evolution, so let's think about soul evolution on a 10-point scale.
Okay.
And I want listeners to not hear me as saying, well, it's so much better and you're so much more important if you're higher on the scale. No, because again, as you said, Ashley, it's just like a child goes to kindergarten and then they go to first grade and then they go to second grade. That's the way the soul evolves. If you're like a seven, an eight, um, e- each time you come back into body, your guide may be the same through many, many lifetimes. At earlier stages of evolution, um, if you take a pretty sizable leap in terms of what you accomplish in a life, then it may be that your guide that you had is replaced by a more evolved guide. So if you're a three on the evolutionary scale, then your guide's probably a six or a seven. If you're a seven on the evolutionary scale, then your guide's at least an eight and maybe a nine.
Hmm.
It's just like going to school. It's if you're a fourth grader, you have a teacher that's used to working with fourth graders. If you're in graduate school at a university, then you have professors that, all have doctoral degrees and that's not to say that the professor's any smarter than the fourth grade teacher. It's just that the level of knowledge, the level of specific understanding elevates as you elevate.
Right. Are we ever a guide and choose not to be in a human when we decide not to be in a human body?
Absolutely, yes. That's a great question. Let me answer that in a couple of ways. If we're, let's say, a seven or an eight on the evolutionary scale, we may still be incarnating, usually we are, we can also serve as a guide when we're incarnating. Because for listeners, remember that we all have a higher self,
Right.
you know. So if Linda is a seven, my higher self is a seven, but my higher self can serve as a guide from the spiritual realm to guide a human in body. So we can be a guide even when we're still incarnating. Um, and at the same time, if we're again, if we're an eight or a nine on a scale on the scale of evolution, then we get to the point where we're allowed to choose if we're going to incarnate anymore or we're not going to incarnate any longer. But what people will often say to me, they'll say, "Oh, Linda, I just want to be done. I want to just, stop coming back into body." And I say, "Well, great, sure. At a certain point, you're given that choice. But what's important to accept is that your higher self has ongoing responsibility in the higher realm to do what they can to coordinate and assist Earth's evolution. So it's not like our higher self just kind of lays around and watches movies and eats pizza or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we get to a 10, how do you, when you're doing a regression, how do you know? Like, can you tell somebody, oh, you're in this grade right now on this in this body as Linda or Ashley?
So there are ways to tell. I mean, first of all, I don't tell people, they tell me during
Right.
regression. So I ask questions to elucidate who are they. So, but there are lots of ways to tell for people. So I train people in regression work, and so training includes a lot of content. One way, and people can read about this in both my books and Michael Newton's books, Dr. Michael Newton's books. Um, when Michael was formulating a foundation about the soul, and he started, he'd been guiding regression for many years, and then he wrote books about the content from clients, which I have done as well. But Michael discovered one piece of the means of determining level of evolution, and that is during the regression, when the client is at their soul level, when they're at their level of higher self, the regression therapist asks, it can be done in a variety of ways. Here's how I do it. Sometimes I'll say to the client, when they're at their soul level, I'll say, imagine there's a mirror in front of you and reflected back to you is the color that represents the core energy of your soul. And we're not talking about aura now because aura relates to the physical body. So imagine there's a mirror in front of you, um, and imagine and trust you can see the color that represents your soul energy. And through repetitive regressions, asking client after client after client the same question, um, tell us about the scale of colors and how that tells us the level of evolution of the client. So, for example, colors such as blue, purple, gold, those are high frequency colors. When they're reflected back to the client, that gives the client and the regression therapist a sense of where that client is on the evolutionary scale. But, you can also tell by how people live their life, what their values are, what their attitude, toward life or toward others. Um, and then during the regression, when the client is at their soul level during the regression, then we're always working with at least a guide. And guides can give information to the client about where they are in their soul's evolution.
Hmm. Would families come together and be up on the same level, or is it always different?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. It's like you would almost never, if not never, you wouldn't have a mom and a dad who are a three and a four, and a child who is an 8 or a 9,
Okay.
because mom and dad need to be able to work with and support a child at an 8 or a 9. And so in a family unit, like a mom, dad, and two children, they wouldn't all be a 7, or they wouldn't all be, a 5, but they'd be fairly similar.
So our goal as a soul is to come back and grow and get to the 10. And even if it takes more time, we can keep coming back because our higher self craves that.
That's correct. That's exactly correct. And the goal is humanity's evolution. The goal is, how can life on this planet reach a higher level of healthiness? So whether we're talking about, do we take care of all living things? Or do we make sure children get their needs met? Um, or um, is 100%, are 100% of humans only focused on themselves? The goal is for humans to learn to be sure they're taking care of their own needs, but to also be other oriented and inclusive, that all people's needs matter.
Right.
And we see, I mean, without going very far down a rabbit hole of challenges on the planet right now, and it isn't just in the United States, we see it in many other places, but we see this struggle with, what do we do about immigrants? And how do we deal with immigrants? Do we decide our country's doorways are just blocked and closed and immigrants' needs don't matter? I mean, are we inclusive or are we exclusive?
Right. So do you think the children that are coming now and being born they're at a higher level already? They're from um to do that, to do the growth, to expansion of this earth?
Yes, and what I know happens, Ashley, because I hear a lot about this from clients, um, it's like, let me see if I can put words to this. The higher selves of souls that are at least a 7, maybe a 6, a 7, those higher selves are constantly, I might say, brainstorming about, okay, so there are, call them committees, call them think tanks, whatever you want to call them, higher selves of souls beyond the mid-range of evolution are observing humanity. And they're saying, what can we do to aid humanity to evolve beyond the point where it is? And then all those higher selves can do is guide us in body. But they're trying to figure out, and at times almost experimenting. And one of the things I know from listening to clients is that there is the intention for more interplanetary and more angelic realm souls to come to Earth to try to catapult our learning on this planet. And in some cases where it's such divisive places of, I'm right and you're wrong, or whatever. I mean, that, in my opinion, that's, Ashley, why you do what you do, is you bring more knowledge, more awareness that is so needed on the planet, um, to help open people's eyes. And yeah, it's so funny. This happens sometimes, and it sort of just started, so my guides are talking to me, and they're wanting me to say a couple of things. So, let me see how to put words to this. For listeners, what I'm hearing from my guides, and I've been pushed on this a lot, and probably Ashley, you have too. It's like, be brave, be courageous. If there's some shift in your life that you just sort of, in your heart of hearts, you need to make, whether that's a work shift, or that's a relationship shift, or a geographic move, or something like that, be brave, because that's how change occurs, is for, souls beyond a five. When we're younger than five, we're just learning how to function and we're learning how to live life in body. But beyond a five, then we move to higher levels of impact and influence on the planet. And one of the types of clients I work with of late, and I'm doing some co-work with a colleague, is working with people that have been working in any kind of industry, any kind of field. I mean, it could be being a hairstylist, it could be real estate, it could be anything. And some of these clients are people, they've accomplished a fair amount in their field, and all of a sudden they get a brainstorm of a more advanced, expanded way, bringing something different into their work that is innovative. And it's like, oh, if I bring that into my work, people are going to, oh, well, will they think that's crazy? Be open and aware, everybody, and be brave. And just as I made a shift in my life many years ago, and perhaps Ashley, so did you, and so do your listeners. It's those shifts that take our culture to a more expanded, evolved place.
Yes. What has been one of your like most different regressions that you've experienced?
Boy, that's a really good question. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is some years ago, the first time I encountered a client, and the client gives me the information. I don't work as a channel and give them the information. Um, I've had numerous clients now, but the first few times I had clients describing the spacecraft where their higher self works, just in detail. The controls, the interior
Wow.
structure, the teamwork that goes on in the spacecraft. And so that's kind of amazing. Another would be that some of the souls that we as spiritual people think of, that are highly evolved, or souls that we might tie to traditional religion, some of those souls continue to incarnate. So, for example, um, I am sure, because of my regression work, that Archangel Michael has aspects of his soul in body on Earth. And I say his, archangels really don't have gender, but
Right.
um, certain highly advanced souls continue to incarnate on Earth because we need the wisdom, we need the evolution of those souls.
Right. So like Archangel Michael, why do you know that he's incarnated?
I know it because I've guided regression clients, and the clients during the regression discover, through their guides that show up in the regression, discover who they are as a soul and why they're in body.
Oh, wow.
That's it, in many ways, that's the purpose of the regression, is who are you as a soul? Why are you here? Where do you come from? And so, and in some cases, and I can tell you that it's just one example, but Archangel Michael is incarnate in more than one body, more than one human. And sometimes that human is some nameable public figure. And but oftentimes those humans are like your neighbor next door that is a nurse that works at the local hospital, for instance. They're
Huh.
not necessarily, famous actors or whatever.
Right. So going back to that spaceship, and we'll end here. Um, right now it's coming out. Like, I don't know if it's what I'm watching, but that I went to Bashar a couple months ago and he was talking about contact within the next 5 years.
Mm.
And he said it could be within the next, year. He was just giving it an average, 5 year span. And now, it's coming up talking about it. Do you feel like those people or those souls are coming now and people are now like it's for a reason? Like, is that why we're seeing it? It's like they're more advanced
Oh
and
yeah.
how do you take that alien contact? What's your take on that?
Yeah. Sadly, some people that are teaching or speaking or writing, I think create or make statements that trigger fear for people, like, uh, you know, aliens are affecting our planet. What that means is advanced souls that aren't Earth-based are doing what they can to come and assist, and they're not harmful. They're not going to do something dangerous. They're coming to be of benefit. And I think it's part of, because I listen to clients all the time, it's part of what the higher realm is trying to do to move our human culture to a more, less divisive, more inclusive, uh, healthier place overall. Yeah.
Right. And to have talk about our frequency and our vibration and how our human body is, I feel, is like upgrading to the higher level, and where like the aliens or the higher dimensional beings that's where we'll start to have more interaction. Do you believe that?
Yes, because as we evolve as a soul, then our soul energy, or we might say the frequency of our soul, evolves. Um, And so, it's just like for many of us, listening, and Ashley and myself, often um, spiritually oriented people um, eat, have a specific diet. Like they can't eat a lot, or I should just say we, not they. We can't eat, or we feel better when we don't eat low frequency foods,
Mm-hmm.
like foods that aren't, pure, healthy in their more natural state. And so as our soul frequency evolves, then our body requires more caretaking in order to support the elevation of our frequency, which often includes diet, the healthy atmosphere, that kind of thing.
When you do your regressions, do you ever go to future? Is that
People ask me a lot. That question comes up fairly often. Um, the future, for each of us, our future lives are dependent on our current life. So that because we evolve in real time, um, our future life can be a possibility. But what our future life or lives looks like depends on how we live our current life.
right? Yeah. So, when you speak of time, when you're doing these regressions, it's all happening at the same time.
So a lot of people will say, well, why do we need to know about our past lives? Past, present, and future are all collapsed. That's not true. Humanity and our own soul evolves in real time. So the past is the past,
Okay.
current time is current, and the future is in fact in the future.
Okay. Oh, I love that. So, okay, we did it. And that was so fun. And I just, it's like I could be doing this. I have all these like, okay, well, I want you to tell me this. But thank you. I loved it. Tell people how to find you. The Raven's Heart, it's like that story about the Raven. Could you end that? Because that's your website. We're going to tell everyone how to find you. You
Okay.
have classes, you teach how to do regressions. Your husband does sessions. And you've opened up this whole new world for me, and I'm so grateful. But explain the Raven story and why you call it the Raven
Okay.
Heart.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I call my work the Ravenheart Center, and that's because years ago, when my colleague, whose name was Bud, as we've talked about, when Bud passed, and all this was completely new to me, I decided for the first time in my life I had to go find someone who could channel and do mediumship work. So I found a woman in the town where I was living at the time, and I went to have a session with her, and among various ways that she validated some of the intuitive information that was coming to me, she said that Bud's energy, that Bud would show up in my life at times as a raven. So, okay, fine. So one of the examples, there were many, but one of the examples that happened, oh, I don't know, probably 3 to 6 months later, I was teaching an all-day Saturday workshop for women about spirituality. And the morning of the workshop, one of the women that was going to attend called me and she said, Linda, I have a really weird request. And she said, and she didn't know anything about the Raven and what the channel had told me. And she said, I got up this morning and she said there was a wounded raven on my front porch. And she said, I've put it in a cat cage, cat carrier that I have. I'm trying to feed it. And she said, I'm afraid if I leave it all day, by the time I come home, the raven will die. Could I please bring the cat carrier with me? I'll just put it off in the corner. If the bird starts making noise, I'll take it outside. But could I bring the raven to your workshop? And, and I said, absolutely, please bring the raven. So that was just one indication. So my website is Raven, this is all run together, ravenheartcenter.com.
Love it. Oh, and you can get your books, Amazon or on your website.
Yep, and new book coming next year. It will have a lot more angelic soul. It'll be broad-based, but it will have much more angelic soul client material than is in my previous books.
Oh, fun. I can't wait. Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed this so much, Linda.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.